also a doctoral student at Liberty University. And today I'll be talking about the WPA. I'll break it up into three parts. First the national WPA, then Texas, then Houston. And I first got my start dealing with the WPA when I was 13 years old. And my mother, who was trying to improve her typing skills, asked my sisters and I to write something about something so she could improve on it. And me, being the total nerd geek, wrote 10 pages on the WPA, just out of my head. So it all started from there. The reason why I've delved into this, because I think it's an interesting part of our history in the United States of work relief. And the deeper that I've delved into it, the more interesting it's gotten. And what's funny is, as the research has evolved, not only my first research part, which was the Federal Writers Project, and then now, it's the letters that were sent to not only the National Director of the Federal Writers Project, but also the National Director of the WPA. And it's interesting that in this dichotomy of people across the spectrum, not only upper class, but also lower class, on just how much the depression actually affected them and how badly they wanted jobs. And so that's why, if people ask me why I've gotten into it, that's pretty much it. So Nick Taylor wrote this book called American Made, and I thought it was interesting that this introduction it just encompasses everything about the national fabric of the country and how this program affected so many lives, okay? And so by the start of this presidential order of 1935, and for those that don't know about the WPA, it was kind of an umbrella organization. It crossed so many lines and so many spectra, okay? And the idea was essentially just to put people to work, and it was never meant, in my estimation, there are some historians that might argue with me, and that's fine. It was never, in my estimation, to cure the depression. Its job was to temporarily hire people to have a paycheck coming in, maybe to install some dignity into the breadwinner's household. And then eventually, once they would either, the public sector would open up for jobs, or they would learn a trade, they could apply that after they were gone. So that's why there was a lot of turnover in the employment, not only within the white collar, but the blue collar workers. All right, and so these are part of what's interesting is that the NYA was actually headed by Lyndon B. Johnson in Texas, and of course, his understanding and love of the New Deal eventually became part and parcel of what we call the Great Society. Okay. There was a white collar project as well called Federal Project Number 1, and part of my research was in Texas, is part of the Federal Writers Project. And the idea was, as Harry Hopkins had said, that they need jobs too. They need to eat too. Writers, actors, musicians, they need to eat. And so this was formed as well. And I know that within the state of Texas, there are the state guides, and you can actually access it online. Right? And this also goes through some of the programs that were part of it as well. And the RFC and the FERA preceded the WPA, but it part and parcel became part of this. Okay. All right, and this is just going through some of the white collar projects. And this is the division. So you could see as you look at this that how far it was part of the American society from 35 to 43, that it was just almost everywhere. And its job was to put people to work. Okay, and there actually came from one of the projects. All right. So I'm going to go through some of these. I don't know if you know about the Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles. I guess if you watch the show Lucifer, they show this thing all the time. That was built by the WPA. This is a ski lodge in Fort Timberland, Oregon. A very good friend of mine, one of my best friends, stayed there, and he was just completely awestruck by it. There's, of course, the road development, LaGuardia. Bremerton Public Library. Okay, now, the WPA in Texas. It was run by H.B. Draw. Its headquarters was in San Antonio, and it oversaw both the blue collar and the white collar projects, okay? And one good thing about Drott was that he was very liberal-minded when it dealt with the white-collar projects. In some states, the WPA administrator thought of the white-collar projects as something as an aside, something as a joke, and so they didn't handle it with a lot of care. But Drott was a little different. He actually tried to improve on the situation, and he helped J. Frank, Davis, who was the head of the Federal Writers Project in Texas. And Davis and Drott had a really good relationship. Okay. Now, across the state, there were over 600 people, people that were employed across the state in very many projects. Let's see, there was the sewing project. There was an actual library project, strangely enough. There were adult education. The WPA actually would have people, and they would help them get their GEDs. There were other projects that there are so many. I can't even list them all. Okay. Now, see, that's also the parks. We'll get to this. There we go. The Baytown Post Office was part of that. Okay. Lometa, Texas. A lot of libraries were built by the WPA. And also the murals in some of the post offices. If you go to some of the post offices in West Texas, if you look up, you'll see the murals. That was done by the WPA art project. Okay. And intricate details on what was going on with that. So you'll have, I think, the Alamo Stadium, and I think Alamo ISD still using, was built by the WPA. Dealey Plaza, which is kind of infamous now, but did I do that again? Go backwards. The Riverwalk. The entry point, I think, up to, I want to say, a mile, maybe a mile and a half. Not the extension, but the original point was actually built by the WPA. And the Federal Writers Project wrote about it as well. And the Federal Writers Project, their guides were, there was a state guide, a city guide, and a local guide. Well, the local guide was actually constructed and written about the Riverwalk, so they could actually use this as a mechanism for people to come and visit. So the Federal Writers Project worked with the WPA on many projects on how to get people to come visit it, and also to espouse the fact that this was improving the state. Okay, now to the WPA in Houston. It was housed in the Benz and Hampshire buildings. It occupied in the Benz building, there were, I think, 13 offices. And in the Hampshire building, they just had rented square footage. Now, the idea was that in the WPA, many localities would offer, they would have ideas. These ideas would germinate in either boards or whatever the case may be. So the idea was we would provide a certain portion of whatever we want built, and the WPA would help with either finances or would help with people and finances. So for example, you would say, okay, West Undershirt, which is part of Houston, wants to build, I don't know, drainage ditches. Okay, well, we're gonna come up with estimations, we're gonna come up with an idea, and we're gonna say, well, we'll offer this if you come up with that. So it's kind of a mix and match, right? And then it would go to the board, right? Many times it would go to the local boards, many times it would go to the local and state boards, and then if it got approved, then it got done. Okay. So this is actually from the Albert Thomas papers, and the reason why I mention this is because even though there's a lot of numbers and number crunching, the intricacies on how this got approved is part of my three-pronged part of my research, which I'll get to in a second. Okay, and so what I'm looking at is I'm looking at all these intricacies as to why parts of Houston wanted this done. Okay, so this was Albert Thomas, and there were in 1940 they would reestablish in different years they would reestablish on how many people were employed, and it was a percentage of the total population of whatever the county or the town was. Okay, so you couldn't have it that high. Again, going back to the point I tried to stipulate, is that this was work relief. This was always supposed to be temporary. It was never supposed to be permanent. So that's why you had a lot of turnover. So it was incumbent, especially on Albert Thomas, who was a House rep, that he tried to defend the city as much as he could. So that's where this came from. Okay? So I think there's a chart that's coming up. All right, and there's also two others here on, these are actual projects that were approved. And one of them, as you can see, is Pelly, Texas. And that kind of threw me, because I'm sure George knows what Pelly, Texas is, but I didn't know it was, there were 3 towns that encompassed before Baytown, was Goose Creek and Pelly were 2 of them. I did not know that. Not your head, yes. Okay, see, so that was part of it, and there's another one that's part of drainage. And if anybody knows Houston, flooding is a big concern, even not only 2021, but also back in 1939, right? So flooding was a big deal. So in this, I know this isn't really sexy and big time, but to me, I think it's interesting because flood control, there were at least, I counted off the top of my head in part of these papers, on the flood control on Houston alone that the WPA actually built. So some of the, not the original pipe, obviously, thank God it's not there, but the designs and the schematics of some of the flood controls, especially downtown in that 10-mile square radius, actually came from the WPA. Okay? Now, I think this is interesting, and I'll tell you why. This is actually from Mr. Jefferson, for Jefferson, okay? Right there. And I don't know if y'all know what Jefferson Stadium is? Nobody? Yes? Well, I know you do, George. Okay, well, actually, it became the home of the Oilers and the AFL championships. Well, it also eventually became Robertson Stadium, which is now TEDCU, yeah, Stadium. Okay, there you go. But that's the actual original letter from Jefferson going through Stafford to eventually draw, but it got approved. Okay, and that's what it looks like now. Okay, and then there is actually another one. All right, to assist in the work project. Oh, wait, this is the actual. This is actually what got mailed in after they gave the charts and such. So I do this because it's a major point as to looking at what got approved, what didn't, and what the nuances were on as far as money and people were concerned. I got 1 minute. All righty then. Okay, this is my research, and this finishes it. I want to see what the role cultural nationalism played in the organization of the WPA. I want to know the hiring practices. Okay, I want to also know, did it make the cultural nationalism acceptable to local and state officials by meaning that did the hiring practices from the Northeast liberalism, did it affect what they happened, okay, and what was dealed out? Also, was there a conflict between the Texas officials and the New Deal cultural nationalism that shaped the WPA blue collar projects? If there had been no pressure from the National WPA office, would the Texas WPA projects even hired minorities? That's the basis of mine. And there you go. That was actually done.